Kia ora tātou and welcome back. And yesterday when we gathered in the evening, I presented an academic's perspective and also an enthusiastic amateur museum enthusiast's perspective, and I issued the challenge to consider the museum sector as a critical part of New Zealand's bid to become a testing ground for leadership. And I've been struck since that period. I've had conversations with at least about 50 of you who have basically educated me to say we are well on our way to doing that already. It's just the other sectors that haven't realised that yet. And so I've been hugely impressed by the degree of experimentation, innovation around governance and leadership, and I wish I was able to share that. So you've got an academic's perspective, and there are those that we're in the business of raising questions, but we're very honoured now to have a leader's perspective, in particular two leaders. And the two gentlemen that will be speaking have between them 60 years experience leading and working in the testing ground of leadership. And essentially what we'll do in the time remaining, I'm going to call upon Andrew Sayers, our keynote speaker, to speak about the topic of what we talk about when we talk about leadership. And we talked yesterday about the process of leadership, and talk is fundamental to that process. And so I'm really looking forward to Andrew's perspectives on that. By way of responding, we have Michael Houlihan, the CEO of Te Papa Tangaroa, who will be responding to the points that are raised by Andrew. And then I'm going to give you, within your tables, 5 minutes to engage in frenzied conversation and dialogue. And we'll then debrief in terms of what were the kind of key points that you would want to underline or take issue with, or really want to put out to say this is an important aspect of the talk and the work of leadership. So I'm going to ask Andrew and Michael to come to the table here. And I will begin by formally introducing our kaumata, Andrew Sayers. I thought did an absolutely marvellous job at the Palfrey today. Andrew began his career at the Art Gallery of New South Wales before moving to Newcastle Region Art Gallery as an assistant director. In 1985, he joined the National Gallery of Australia as curator of Australian drawings. 13 years later, he was Assistant Director of Collections. And one thing that I was particularly excited about last night was I found out he was the inaugural director of the National Portrait Gallery. I'm a major portrait enthusiast, particularly the link between leadership and portrayal of leadership. And I visited Canberra. If you haven't yet seen it, it's by far the best portrait gallery, I think, in the world. And he was a key driver behind the transformation of that collection, but also the very fine lakeside building that houses the collection. That job done, he moved on to become the director of the National Museum of Australia in June 2010. He's been awarded a member of the Order of Australia for his service to art administration. He's been awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Canberra. He's the chair of Canberra Glassworks. And as we heard earlier today, he is acting the role as National President of Museums Australia. So a very rich source and a very varied vantage point from which to talk to leadership. And so you had the academic's perspective, now you get the practitioner's, the leader's perspective. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome from Museum de Aotearoa to Andrew Sayers.
Thanks very much, Brad, for that introduction. It kind of makes you feel like it's time to retire when somebody introduces you as being part of two people who between us have had decades of experience of museum leadership. And in fact I am going to be leaving the National Museum in a couple of months' time. So look out for the ad coming to a website near you if you feel as though you would like to take on that challenging role and very rewarding role in Australia. Thank you for the invitation to deliver the keynote here, Museums Aotearoa. And thank you, Philippa. Thank you too for the opportunity to play a part in the porphyry this morning at the Waikato Museum. Well, we do talk a lot about leadership. I'm no expert when it comes to leadership as a subject of study, and I'm no expert in management theory. So today I thought I'd simply talk about leadership as a lived experience and tell some stories about the museums I have had a part in leading over the past couple of decades. I actually thought of calling this talk paraphrasing the famous first lines of Gombrich's The Story of Art. There is really no such thing as leadership. There are only leaders. If you remember, Gombrich started by saying there is no such thing as art. There's only artists. But that's a little provocative. Of course, there's such a thing as leadership. But I'm going to talk about leaders today. All right. Let's see if I can get this to work. Where do I point it? Point it to God. Which one do I press? Maybe I've pressed it now way too many times and made it stop. Oh, it's coming up here now. Well, the picture might appear. I'll carry on. Are we ready now? No? Okay. Like many people in leadership roles, I didn't start out thinking that I was going to end up in one. I didn't have any Dickensian career plan to start out in a junior position and end up director of a cultural institution. If I can get that slide. No, okay. I had at the beginning of my career, as Brad mentioned, been assistant director of the Newcastle Region Art Gallery, a small regional gallery. And although I learnt many things in that role, principally about working with people who had much more experience than I did, my career in senior management didn't really begin until 1996 at the National Gallery of Australia. Okay, I don't think we can get the picture, but that's okay. So, in 1996. Oh, right, okay. So, that's right. Okay, that's where I wanted to begin. With me at age 3.
Whenever you're speaking, it's always
in a museum. So that's where my career started. Actually, didn't really. But the point I wanted to make is I didn't start out at age 3 thinking one day I'm going to be the director of a place like this. My career in leadership really started here in 1996 at the National Gallery of Australia. That's a view of the National Gallery of Australia as it was then. At that time, I was curator of Australian drawings at the gallery. A couple of floors above me in the Tower of Song sat the assistant director responsible for collections, Michael Lloyd. Michael called me into the gallery one Saturday morning and told me he would like me to take on his job. He needed to concentrate firstly on the delivery of a major international exhibition of the painting of Turner, and secondly on managing his lung cancer, just diagnosed and fatal. Now, why did Michael give me that opportunity? I'm not sure, but I guess Michael had noticed some qualities he thought were consistent with management. In the 18 months or so prior to this, I'd taken on the role as union delegate at the museum, and in that role I worked with the gallery executive to solve various staffing and accommodation issues. In Brad's terminology, tame issues. Michael Lloyd probably knew a truth about leadership. No matter how grand it is, you spend a huge amount of time solving staffing and accommodation issues. And in my experience, although they might be the tame issues, they often feel like the wicked ones. So I became one of the assistant directors working in the executive team with the director, Betty Churcher. Betty was the second director of the National Gallery of Australia. She had succeeded the foundation director, James Mollison, in 1989. And I learnt an enormous amount about leadership from both James Mollison and Betty Churcher. James Mollison was completely committed to developing the National Gallery of Australia. He had begun there as interim director in the late 60s. He'd been tried in the fire of public controversy over the acquisition of Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles in 1973. And by the time I arrived at the National Gallery of Australia as a junior curator in 1984, the gallery was very much the court of James Mollison. Since we're talking about leadership, I'd make 2 observations about him. He had a deep and long-standing curiosity about art. Art had interested him from an early age, and he'd worked closely with a number of significant Australian artists, in particular Fred Williams, whose opinions he regarded highly and whom he quoted often. So, as director of the National Gallery, James Mollison's leadership was an extension of his commitment to the core subject of the gallery, namely art. Conviction was the core of his leadership. James had a unique perspective on the leadership role of the National Gallery of Australia within the culture of a country such as Australia. His challenge as director of the gallery could be expressed as follows. How could the National Gallery of Australia, whose principal collection was developed after 1968, be a leader among much longer established art museums with significant collections? I think his answer to this, he may not have put it in these words, these are mine, this is my observation, would have been that the National Gallery of Australia would be nationally significant if it were internationally significant. In other words, there would be a cultural trickle-down effect if the National Gallery were a world player and not simply a local Canberra institution. And how could it be a world player? Well, in the case of the National Gallery, it could be a world player in the quality of its collection. There's no doubt that the funding of the National Gallery of Australia in the 1970s allowed it to make a very significant series of acquisitions of international art. Not only Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles, but also Brancusi birds. In this slide of the gallery, you can see also 2 major works by Monet, Water Lilies, and on the very far side of the slide, the Haystacks. And also the gallery was able in those years to develop very significant collections of Asian and important oceanic art. But it wasn't only a matter of collection building. Developing an internationally recognised cadre of senior staff was also an expression of the National Gallery of Australia's aspirations. During the 1970s, before the gallery actually opened in 1982, it was able to attract significant figures in technical and curatorial fields. And this was another way in which the National Gallery sought to demonstrate its international credentials. I think it could be said that in its aspiration to be a world museum, the National Gallery of Australia was ahead of its time. There's a sense in which in 2013 all major museums have to make claims that they are museums for the world. But the way in which that phrase world museum is now used refers less to the comprehensiveness of particular museums' collections and refers more to the responsibilities that come with having collections of cultural significance. Two vectors have been responsible for the positioning of major museums as world museums. The first of these vectors is the increasing sense of the responsibilities that museums have towards communities of origin, what we might call the responsibilities of custodianship, as opposed to what we may have seen 20 years ago, the importance of ownership. And I talked a little bit about that this morning at the Porphyry. And the second vector is, I think, the possibility of communicating collections which has been enabled by digital technology and connectivity, which, as we know, has had a major effect on museums worldwide. Just to conclude on this subject of world positioning, when I arrived at the National Museum of Australia in 2010, as a view of the National Museum of Australia, its stated aim was to be a world-class museum. I argued to the Council that we should drop this as a mission statement. Not only is there a slight cultural cringe in the formulation world-class, but more importantly, I think that recognition in an international context is an outcome of success in a local context, not something that can guide programming. A museum becomes recognisable in a world context as a result of its distinctiveness, as a result of its unique character, and the way in which it expresses that particular character. In other words, in the ideas that the museum has and the way a museum expresses those ideas. The most valuable resource any particular museum has are its ideas. When I started at the National Museum of Australia, I had a series of roundtables, not discussions, not unlike the one we have here today. And I think I perhaps surprised and perhaps alarmed some people at the museum when I made that point that the most valuable resource the museum has are ideas, because we are used to thinking of collections as the most valuable resource museums have. And I think there was a fear that I was going to diminish the role of the museum's collections. Far from it. Collections are the way in which we express ideas. So, to return to the National Gallery for a moment. Betty Church's leadership of the National Gallery between 1989 and 1997 had a different emphasis from that of James Mollison. Betty was no less committed to the subject of art, but saw her role as a communicator. Indeed, whilst at the National Gallery and subsequently, she became a popular figure on television as a result of her 7-minute programs on the treasures of Australia's national institutions. I don't think Betty saw herself, as James Mollison had, as a collection shaper. This is something she left to the gallery's expert curators. But she did see herself as an educator. She engendered an enthusiasm for the collection in the wider community, and in this she demonstrated leadership through sharing. Maybe that's a dimension of leadership as process that Brad introduced yesterday. During her directorship, the National Gallery ventured into a number of highly successful international exhibitions, and these have become associated with her tenure at the National Gallery. They are really a form of art sharing. It's interesting, when I reflect on this, that Betty Churcher was director of the National Gallery at the time when consensus politics was the mode of Australian political leadership. And so there's an interesting conjunction, and perhaps one could actually study the way in which paradigms of political leadership and paradigms of museum leadership may differ or coincide over time. When Betty Churcher left the National Gallery in 1997, when I was by that stage confirmed in the position of Assistant Director, she was succeeded by Brian Kennedy, who had been Assistant Director of the National Gallery of Ireland. Brian was a very different leader from either Betty Churcher or James Mollison, and I worked through the transition from Betty to Brian. When he arrived, I remarked to him that as the third Director of the National Gallery of Australia, he was inevitably going to be seen in different terms from either James, who was in his time regarded as synonymous with the institution, or Betty, who was James's successor, of course. I sensed that in the early days of the National Gallery of Australia, the staff of the gallery was living in a kind of perpetual present, and that this was represented by the presence of James Mollison, who had been there from before day one. What Betty did was regarded by some staff of the gallery only in terms of a contrast with what James had established. It is extraordinary how rapidly institutional modes of doing things become established in museums. But with the arrival of a third director, the gallery now had a history. It had a recognisable and definable past as well as a present. The point I want to make here is that the history of an institution is, I think, a very important and perhaps underrated dimension of the leadership of museums. Each institution has what we might describe as the rhythm of its own history. And I think it's important that people coming into leadership roles in museums, be they the CEO or council members or senior management, are sensitive to the institution's self-awareness, its sense of its own history. Obviously, I don't mean that museum directors should feel that institutional history is a constraint on change. I simply mean that it's important that incoming museum directors have a serious regard for the currents into which they step when they enter the stream. In 2010, plunging in as third director of the National Museum of Australia, since the museum opened in 2001, I thought it was important to be clear about some of the museum's own history in public statements surrounding my appointment. As many of you in this room will know, the early history of the National Museum of Australia was the subject of controversy in the media. The controversy stemmed principally from the museum's deliberately provocative presentation of the frontier conflicts between Indigenous and settler Australians in the 19th century. This controversy has to be set in a broader political and cultural context in Australia in the early years of the 21st century. During these years, the way in which Australia as a nation should confront and reconcile with this past was a matter of considerable public discussion. And of course, history was a key part of that discussion. So the early history of the National Museum is associated, for better or for worse, with this period defined by the history wars. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time here today talking about this much written about phase of the National Museum's history. There's a lot of literature on it. Suffice to say that when I arrived at the National Museum, I was questioned about the continuing role of the museum in these so-called history wars. But it was clear to me that Australia, to some extent, had moved on. Although journalists, who will usually go back into their files for context, will sometimes be slow to recognise such changes. In an address I made shortly after taking up the position at the National Museum, I said, and I quote here, "I sense a new attitude in Australia towards our history, a broadly based willingness to accept the unequal basis of Australia's colonialism. Perhaps the National Museum has played a part in this and will certainly continue to play a part in telling the story of inhumanity in this country. This is the museum fulfilling its purpose. We examine our history from new perspectives to lead to a more complex understanding of our history and to lead Australians to embrace or repudiate that past." End of quote. Now, when you're the first director of an institution, you are aware of that your place will be a part of the history of that institution. In 1998, I decided to leave the National Gallery of Australia and put myself forward for appointment as director of the newly established National Portrait Gallery of Australia. At that stage, the Portrait Gallery was a very small operation, rather buried in the former Parliament House building in Canberra. Here's a view of the old Parliament House. The building that had been built in 1927, that had been vacated in 1987 with the completion of the new Parliament building. There was very little space, and that space that did exist had been carved out of an old administrative building and was therefore less than ideal. And there were very few staff, half a dozen, and there was no collection. But as I said earlier, the greatest resource a museum has is its idea, and the Portrait Gallery was a great idea. And I thought it had a huge amount of potential. It was also fortunate to have political support, and it had the very vigorous support of two devoted philanthropists, Gordon and Marilyn Darling. So it seemed like the Portrait Gallery could only go from strength to strength, as indeed it did in the ensuing decade. When I left the Portrait Gallery 12 years later, it is now housed in a purpose-built building with a staff of 55 and a growing collection. It is the most beautiful building in Canberra, in Brad's view, and also mine. Almost everything I know about leadership was knowledge gained over the 12 years of the establishment and the story of the National Portrait Gallery. And I was fortunate that I was, as it were, able to catch a wave in those 12 years. Not every period in time is as rewarding for an institution as were those years. There was support from a government running surplus budgets, enormous philanthropic drive, an energetic and committed board. So where did my leadership role fit into this picture? Well, firstly, I wanted to provide leadership by strongly positioning the National Portrait Gallery. It wasn't enough to say that Australia was now up there with other countries that had national portrait galleries. It wasn't enough to say that Australia has a history of interest in portraits and that a National Portrait Gallery was an inevitable expression and extension of that interest. It wasn't enough to say that portraiture is a way into understanding our history. All of those things are true. But to really position a National Portrait Gallery, I felt that we had to connect portraits with contemporary Australia. And we were favoured by the moment. In the late 1990s, portraiture was hot again. Artists' newfound fascination with the genre gave portraiture a currency that it hadn't had for a very long time. Portraits could be about the human condition, about identity, rather than being about officialdom or societal approbation. We deliberately emphasised the contemporary, especially the photographic. we vigorously undertook a series of commissions from very serious artists who in no sense could be called portrait specialists. And I think the marker of the positioning of the portrait gallery was the commissioned sculpture by James Angus, which was commissioned for the forecourt of the portrait gallery building. And the sculpture is called Face Generator, and it works with the idea that we have a tendency to see faces in all sorts of natural objects, such as clouds, rocks, and so on. And so really it's an expression of the fact that portrait galleries are largely projections of the baggage or the ideas that we bring to them. And also that identity in Australia is something which is constantly in a state of change. But of course it's a very contemporary work and it's an abstract work, and in a sense goes against the grain of a portrait gallery, which tends to be very biographically oriented. But it's a statement of contemporary intent, as was the commissioning program. This was the first portrait commissioned by the National Portrait Gallery in 1999 by the late Howard Arkley, who at that time was Australia's artist representing Australia at the Venice Biennale. And we commissioned this portrait of Nick Cave, and it became something of an icon for the National Portrait Gallery and something of an expression of our intention to be serious about the art and also contemporary. I think all directors have their stock phrases. My stock phrases were: magazines are the portrait galleries of our present age, portraits are people, portraiture allows us to talk about what it is to be human, a portrait gallery is an idea, not a building. That last phrase I used to point out that the gallery was not to be defined by the historical framing provided by the 1927 government Parliament building, which was its first home. Because I wanted to point to a future in which the building of a purpose-built building, specifically to allow for the intimate encounter between the visitor and the portrait, could come to pass. And that intimate encounter between the visitor or visitors and the portrait in a well-proportioned space is in fact the heart of the portrait gallery experience. And that was the idea from which the architectural brief for the building grew. A lot of people actually said, oh, it would be a tragedy if the National Portrait Gallery left the 1927 Parliament building because the idea of portraits and history embodied in that building fitted together so beautifully. Well, those people had never actually had to hang portraits and make them look good fighting with 1927 carpet or 1927 Art Deco architraves. So the National Portrait Gallery had to be positioned in terms of contemporary culture, but it also had to be positioned in terms of the other national cultural institutions in Australia, all of them telling the Australian story. And here I thought it was important to be clear about what the portrait gallery was not to be, as much as what it could be. Early in the life of the gallery, we invited the former director of the National Portrait Gallery in London, Sir Roy Strong, who has gone down in history as having transformed and revolutionised that institution back in the late 60s. We invited him to talk in Canberra, and we engaged him in a staff discussion. And he made a point there that I've never forgotten. He said, rather provocatively, portrait galleries, often unlike other sorts of museums, are happy places. Why? Well, I think it's got something to do with the relatively small size of portrait galleries And also it has something to do with the simplicity of the specialist museum's mandate. Portraits are not only a very approachable form of art, they're also a very defined form. There's a core understanding of what a portrait is, in spite of the will to extend the range of work that's encompassed within its definition. It's this shared understanding that gives portrait galleries their definitional simplicity. And it's also why I think visitors enjoy enormously smaller scale museums and specialist museums. Not all museums are as favourably positioned to define themselves with such simple means. In fact, when the current Council of the National Museum of Australia asks me what I consider to be the most significant risk facing the museum, my reply is as follows. The greatest risk is a failure to articulate with clarity what the museum is and what it stands for. The task of creating clear definition is, I think, the most important leadership work for a museum director. Clear definition creates communities of support. These communities of support in turn create positive funding outcomes, and those positive funding outcomes in turn create the museum's value as a public entity. From the point of view of leadership, this continuum is important. Repeatedly in my career, I've had funding entities, governments, ministers, grants organisations, culture departments say, don't ask us for funding, demonstrate what you want to do, and then come to us and tell us how we can help you to achieve an even better result or to extend what you want to do. There's no more powerful statement of success than public support. Showing what can be done on a small scale or in a pilot is a form of leadership, taking an idea, demonstrating it, garnering support for it. We might call that another version of leadership in a process. And I think that certainly that has been my experience throughout the various phases of the life of the National Portrait Gallery. Small things demonstrate what one can do on a larger scale or in a bigger framework. In the history of the National Portrait Gallery, there are other dimensions of leadership behaviour that I think are particularly relevant. I mentioned earlier that there's strong philanthropic support for the National Portrait Gallery from Gordon and Marilyn Darling. They invested a huge deal of personal time, energy and enthusiasm in the Portrait Gallery, and they believe strongly in leadership by example. From day one, they gave portraits to the collection, hoping that the example would elicit other donations. And they gave very significant funds to the gallery, again as an encouragement for other philanthropists to continue to fund the collection. And the fact that the board chair had herself contributed materially to developing the collection and the gallery created a very powerful platform from which she was able to argue to philanthropists and the government for additional funding for the gallery, its acquisitions and its programs. Incidentally, and perhaps not surprisingly, as believers in the concept of leadership, the Darlings have been the driving force between the museum leadership program in Australia. According to the 20-year report of the Gordon Darling Foundation, the philanthropic foundation established by Gordon Darling, the museum leadership program in Australia arose from, quote, the need for senior staff, having generally risen from within the museum profession, to receive specialist leadership and management training that was directly applicable to the museum environment. End of quote. In the mid-1990s, Gordon Darling observed a lack of such training opportunities in Australia. In 1997, a one-off symposium was held to gauge support and enthusiasm for an Australian-based program along the lines of the long-established Getty Museum program. And so in 1999, the first museum leadership program in Australia commenced. Since 1999, 235 museum professionals from Australia, New Zealand, Singapore and Hong Kong have attended the 6 programs that have been held. It's been a highly strategic and successful program in developing leadership in the Australian museum sector, and several people who undertook the program are now heads of major institutions, and there are a host of senior executives, deputy directors and directors of smaller and pivotal organisations who have undertaken the course. So if we're looking at this question of aspects of the museum environment that call for a particular kind of leadership, there are quite a number of these in my experience. And to some extent they derive from the fact that museums are complex businesses with a number of different models of behaviour in balance and sometimes in conflict. Among these motivations, sometimes in balance and sometimes in conflict, we might include the following. Many of the professionals in museums see their work Many of the professionals in museums see their work through the prism of professional peer acceptance, and their duty to the public at large can be overlooked. Then, the imperatives of local government tourism agendas often divert museums away from their responsibility to citizens, leading to a chase for visitor numbers at all costs. And demands for museums to look innovative can lead to very expensive investment in digital presentations that often do not add significantly to the visitor experience. In other words, we're doing this because we're doing it for the sake of it. These are just a few of the tensions that are characteristic of museums in the 21st century, and I'm sure that you could enumerate many more. And in fact, during the question time, that might be something to think about, particularly in relation to the institutions, museums, galleries that you currently work. The point I wanted to make is that aside from the leadership challenge of institutional definition that I referred to earlier, we also face challenges in institutional coherence. Leadership here is in maintaining the strongest possible emphasis on the public as an entity, citizens, ratepayers, taxpayers, on the public as our visitors, and the public as individuals for whom we aim ideally to provide transformative experiences. I think we are fortunate in museums to have a position as enrichers of society. What we provide is a form of cultural enrichment, and this gives us tremendous strength. This is what Robert Janes had in mind, I think, when he wrote that one of the characteristics of museums is that they are free to think and act. That's a gift. We should never lose sight of this tremendous capacity that gives us, that we have to define institutions that we want in the way we want, that may from time to time coincide with other people's agendas, if I can put it that way, but very often do not. There's nothing more corrosive to institutional coherence than a program that flies off in all directions to fulfil the imperatives of what I describe in my museum as other agendas. National institutions, such as the National Museum of Australia, are often thought to be at the beck and call of the Department of Foreign Affairs to provide exhibitions and other forms of cultural exchange which happen to fit the particular agendas of national governments. And large institutions are always, I think, at the behest of large tourism departments. And it seems to me that we have to be very, very careful to negotiate our way through these conflicting agendas and remain focused on what we believe our institutions should do for our communities. I was lucky at the National Portrait Gallery to have a major building project to create institutional coherence. A new building allows for an image of the future to be clearly seen and clearly shared. So again, that's a kind of gift to a leader. Perhaps this is why incoming museum directors and boards tend to describe the future in terms of new building extensions. They often begin by rebranding their institutions, sometimes very effectively, sometimes disastrously. Perhaps we do need to take the focus off that kind of leadership through results. When public success of museum leaders is assessed, very often the thing that people point to is the building of new buildings or extensions. That's leadership through results, and it's very hard to argue against that. Garnering support for new capital projects is a very visible measure of leadership success, and there have been many examples of the capacity for the museum experience to be enhanced by such capital projects. But not every phase in the life of a museum is about expansion, and it's often much more difficult to see successful leadership in times of contraction. Yet this is where much of our work has to be done, and much of our work must be done in the future. In rationalising existing collections, getting the most out of them, and presenting them in new ways to new audiences. And we'll have to do this in the context of the important work of reducing our impact on increasingly scarce resources. Although difficult, I'd like to think of our cultural organisations as having the capacity to refine what we do, to be really focused in times of economic challenge, such as we are no doubt facing. In his 1939 lectures on the poetics of music, the great 20th century composer Stravinsky said, "I have no use for a theoretical freedom. Let me have something finite, definite, matter that can lend itself to my operation only insofar as it is commensurate with my possibilities. And such matter presents itself to me together with its limitations. I must in turn impose mine upon it. So here we are, whether we like it or not, in the realm of necessity. And yet, which of us has ever heard talk of art as other than the realm of freedom? This sort of heresy is uniformly widespread because it is imagined that art is outside the bounds of ordinary activity. Well, in art, as in everything else, one can build only on a resisting foundation. Whatever constantly gives way to pressure constantly renders movement impossible." Stravinsky continues, "My freedom thus consists in my moving about within the narrow frame I've assigned myself for each of my undertakings. I shall go even further. My freedom will be so much the greater and more meaningful, the more narrowly I limit my field of action and the more I surround myself with obstacles. Whatever diminishes constraint diminishes strength. The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself from the chains that shackle the spirit." Now, for several years, when things have looked bleak, this marvellous credo of Stravinsky's is one of two I've returned to for inspiration. It's a dangerous philosophy to bring out in discussions with the Department of Finance, but Stravinsky's point is surely this, that greatness can be achieved within limitations, can only be achieved within the limitations of the given. In running museums, as in any other creative endeavour, we have to balance with flexibility and originality the constant re-evaluation of needs, desires and means. And I think this is going to be the greatest challenge for the future generation of museum leaders. Thank you.